The young girl took off her dress and slipped into the water. Moments later, she emerged soaking wet. The sunlight through the water droplets outlined her moving figure. And all of this was in full view of the servant standing nearby. However, Cecilia didn't feel embarrassed. She quickly dressed and took something from the servant's hand. Then, she quickly left the scene. However, this alluring moment was keenly observed by the young girl's sister from the second-floor window. Although she didn't know what the two were doing, a huge suspicion grew in her heart. The seed of sin began to sprout in her mind. She had secretly had a crush on Robbie for a long time, and even once jumped into the lake to test if he liked her, despite the danger. At that moment, when young Robbie picked her up, she thought she had found mutual love. But her ignorance only led to Robbie's disgust. Now, with the same scenario of falling into the water, Robbie's attitude towards her sister was completely different. This made her instantly feel resentment, even thinking Robbie was a hypocrite. But things were not as she thought. In fact, Cecilia and Robbie had been childhood sweethearts, but since one was a wealthy heiress and the other a housekeeper's son, they rarely interacted in front of others, leading everyone to believe their relationship was merely master and servant. Little did they know, feelings had long developed between them, but neither had broken the unspoken barrier. However, as they grew older and their feelings deepened, Robbie was unwilling to remain just a servant's son, so he decided to study medicine abroad to elevate his social status and rightfully be with Cecilia. Since studying medicine would take at least 6 years, Cecilia was reluctant, but she was too shy to ask him to stay, so she subtly suggested he follow his father's advice and stay to teach and earn money. Originally, it was just a casual remark, but since Robbie's tuition had always been sponsored by Cecilia's father, his already low self-esteem made him think she was hinting that he shouldn't continue spending her family's money. So, somewhat angrily, he said he would repay all the tuition fees in full in the future. Suddenly, the misunderstood Cecilia replied sadly, "That's not what I meant at all." Then, she turned away in disappointment. Realizing his mistake, Robbie ran after her. Just then, they arrived at a fountain, and Cecilia, holding a vase, wanted to fill it with water. Robbie, however, shamelessly insisted on helping. As a result, he ended up breaking the handle. Although the vase was very valuable, it wasn't worth diving in to retrieve the pieces. But Cecilia, out of spite, took off her coat in front of Robbie and immediately jumped into the water. When she climbed out, holding the pieces, soaking wet, Robbie was stunned, as the girl before him was breathtakingly beautiful. The two of them just stood there, gazing into each other's eyes for a long time, until Robbie, realizing what was happening, shyly turned his head away. Cecilia quickly got dressed and then hurriedly left with the vase. Watching the woman he loved walk away, Robbie turned around dejectedly and walked to the edge of the pool. Then, he gently touched the rippling water with his palm, as if he could feel Cecilia's warmth that way. Perhaps because the scene was too stunning, Robbie couldn't calm down even after returning to his room. Suddenly, he realized his earlier behavior was too abrupt, so he decided to write a letter of apology. But as the typewriter clicked away, the words of apology gradually turned into expressions of longing for Cecilia. He quickly realized this was inappropriate, so after a self-deprecating laugh, he seriously handwrote a new letter. Not only that, but to be more cautious, he polished his shoes and changed into formal attire. Only then did he head out with the envelope. However, as he neared his destination, he suddenly felt embarrassed. Just then, his sister Bryony appeared, so Robbie asked her to deliver it for him. However, as Bryony took the letter and ran off, Robbie suddenly remembered he had mistakenly put the explicit love letter in the envelope. Despite his desperate shouts, it was too late. Bryony, after receiving the letter, didn't deliver it immediately. Driven by curiosity and jealousy, she peeked at its contents. With just a glance, she was so shocked she couldn't speak, but it also confirmed to her that Robbie was a hypocrite. Perhaps the letter's content was too explicit, so when Cecilia saw it, she immediately suspected there was another envelope. But no matter how much she asked, Bryony remained silent. Meanwhile, to clear up the misunderstanding, Robbie decided to apologize in person. But when he rang the doorbell and saw Cecilia, he was so stunned by her green dress that he couldn't utter a word. After a long while, he finally stammered that the letter was actually a misunderstanding. "I was planning to give you another one." Cecilia listened without responding, but with a smile, she turned and walked into the room. Robbie, strong and following her beautiful silhouette, entered the study. During this, Cecilia's earring accidentally fell, but both, overwhelmed with emotions, didn't notice. Then, Robbie closed the door, and Cecilia turned on the lamp. In the dimly lit space, after pouring out their hearts to each other, they finally confirmed their feelings for one another. While they were expressing their love, a cousin visiting the house found Bryony, complaining that her twin brothers had tormented her, leaving her wrist red and swollen. But Bryony, having just read the letter, wasn't in the mood to listen to her complaints and instead mentioned the letter. After hearing Bryony's account of the letter's contents, The cousin immediately cursed Robbie as a big pervert and urged Bryony to hand the letter over to the police. But Bryony, afraid that Robbie's true nature would be exposed and he might do worse things to her and Cecilia, asked her cousin to keep it a secret for now. After sending the cousin away, Bryony left the room. As he went downstairs and past the study, he immediately saw Cecilia's fallen earring. Then, following the sound, he quietly entered the study and saw the scene he least wanted to see. Caught by surprise, Robbie and Cecilia awkwardly tidied up their clothes and then pretended nothing had happened as they walked out one after the other. Bryony watched them leave. At this point, a seed of ambition took root and sprouted in his heart. That evening, Cecilia's family hosted a dinner for a famous wealthy businessman. At the dinner table, Robbie, of humble origins, appeared somewhat reserved. Cecilia, strong and gentle, hooked his finger under the table, both comforting him and conveying her love. Unexpectedly, Bryony suddenly ran over with a letter. Cecilia thought it was the one Robbie wrote, and was so startled she nearly jumped out of her chair. Fortunately, it was just a letter left by the twin boys staying at their house. Unfortunately, the twins, homesick, had left to find their mother. Upon hearing this, everyone worried about potential dangers, as the boys were still young, so they immediately ended the dinner and went out to search for the children. Bryony, strong, also went out, but the picturesque and grand countryside castle during the day. In the dark night, it seemed a bit eerie and terrifying. Bryony could only hold a flashlight and explore cautiously. Unexpectedly, when she reached a patch of grass, she saw a couple entangled on the ground. Bryony was so frightened that she immediately dropped the flashlight, while the man took the opportunity to flee the scene in a panic. When Bryony mustered the courage to approach, she discovered that the woman was actually her cousin. Earlier, the distance was too far and it was too dark for Bryony to see the man's face clearly. So she asked her cousin who he was, but her cousin tearfully said, "I don't know, because he covered my eyes from the start." After a few seconds of silent thought, Bryony suddenly said firmly, "I saw him. It was Robbie." Even though her cousin repeatedly expressed uncertainty, Bryony was still convinced that the man was Robbie, because she had seen Robbie commit the same vile act against Cecilia during the day. Due to the severity of the incident, Bryony's older brother took her cousin back to the house and immediately called the police. The police arrived quickly, and when questioned by them, Bryony insisted that the perpetrator was Robbie. I saw him," she said, trying to convince everyone. To support her claim, she even produced a lewd letter written by Robbie and handed it to her mother for inspection. With both witness and evidence, everyone considered Robbie the criminal, except for Cecilia. She knew it wasn't true because they had grown up together. She trusted Robbie's character and believed in their relationship. She knew Robbie would never do such a thing. So she went to the police to explain on Robbie's behalf, saying, "Bryony always lets her imagination run wild. You can't fully trust what he says." Bryony had always loved writing, and his stories often received praise from his mother. But this also led the young Bryony to dramatize reality. However, this explanation clearly lacked persuasive power. After the questioning, Cecilia was worried. She hid by the door like a spirit in the night, waiting for her lover to return. Shortly after, Robbie brought the two children back, but before she could understand the situation, the police put cold handcuffs on him, giving him no chance to explain. In this group of either rich or noble people, her status was the lowest and most humble. No one would believe her words, and no one cared if she was wronged. As the police car drove out the gate, Robbie's mother rushed up, pounding on the car and cursing that everyone here was a liar. Cecilia stood hopelessly at the door, for he truly was powerless. Upstairs, Bryony had tears in her eyes. Perhaps this wasn't the outcome he wanted, but undeniably, his jealousy and prejudice completely ruined Robbie's life. In the blink of an eye, 4 years passed. Robbie, still in prison, was forced to join the army and was about to head to the front lines of World War II. Just the day before departure, he unexpectedly saw Cecilia in the restaurant. It turned out that Cecilia, upon hearing the news of his going to war, had become a field nurse. Despite not seeing each other for years and their longing for each other, the passage of time made them silent like strangers. To seize this rare reunion, Cecilia took the initiative to hold Robbie's hand. Unexpectedly, Robbie hesitated for a moment and then refused, because he was heading into a life-or-death situation and wasn't sure if he could bring Cecilia happiness. He was also uncertain if that moment in the study could sustain them for a lifetime. But Cecilia was unwavering in her feelings and said, "Only you can give me happiness. You must come back to me." Hearing these deeply affectionate words, Robbie finally released the emotions he had suppressed for so long and promised he would return alive. On the day Robbie left for the battlefield, Cecilia gave him a photo of a house by the sea, with white walls and blue-painted curtains. Cecilia hoped they could spend the rest of their lives there together. With dreams of a beautiful future, they passionately kissed on the street and reluctantly said goodbye. Watching the tram carry Cecilia away, Robbie couldn't help but run after it, but ultimately, he could only watch his beloved fade into the distance. Later, The war took Robbie to France in 1940. In 1940, the British and French forces he was with fought the Germans on French soil. Unfortunately, under the fierce attack of the German mechanized troops, they were defeated. Robbie and 2 comrades got separated from the main force. To ensure their safety, they hid in local farmers' homes at night and walked to the beaches of northwestern France by day to retreat with the main force back to England. Along the way, Robbie witnessed the horrors of war. The brutality of war filled him with despair and sadness about life, but whenever he felt he couldn't go on, he would take out the photo Cecilia gave him and look at it for a long time, because the promise of his lover always gave him the courage to continue. And every time after looking at it, he would place the photo, along with the letters Cecilia wrote to him, close to his heart, constantly reminding himself to hold on, to stay alive, and to return to marry Cecilia. No one knows how long they walked, but Robbie and his group finally saw hope. However, when they finally found the main force, they discovered that 300,000 people were stranded on the beach, waiting to be taken home by ships. It might take a very long time. Worse still, the ships that came to pick them up were repeatedly bombed by the Germans. For a moment, Robbie's heart sank to the bottom of the sea. This was the famous Dunkirk evacuation in history. The dim setting sun shrouded the city, now in ruins. The once tall buildings had turned into broken walls and rubble. The once picturesque landscape had become a living hell. Here, there was confusion bearing great sins, faces clouded with sorrow and despair at the end of the road. Dignity and life seemed to have been stripped away. The joys and sorrows of war had become numb, leaving only helplessness and despair. Many of them were forced to die in a foreign land, without any sign that they had ever been in this world or set foot on this land. Robbie was not spared from the clutches of fate either. It turned out she was injured on the battlefield, and due to a lack of effective medical treatment, her condition gradually worsened, leading to confusion and hallucinations. In a daze, she seemed to see her mother, who prepared a basin of hot water for her, washing away the hardships and struggles of her journey. Robbie, with red eyes, told her mother that there was a woman waiting for him at home, and he must return because he promised to marry her. Then he ran out barefoot from the makeshift shelter. His comrades, noticing something was wrong, asked where he was going. He replied, saying he was looking for a house with white walls and blue-painted curtains. His comrades, seeing this, seemed to guess something, so they helped him to a resting place and gave him their only piece of dry food, telling him that the beach was being organized into groups and that they could go home the next morning. Upon hearing this, Robbie was overjoyed and immediately asked his comrades to wake him up at 7 the next morning. Then, in the pitch-black darkness, he trembled as he lit a match, staring at the photo that had long been worn white. Facing this place that captivated his heart, his thoughts returned to that scorching summer, seeing the swaying green dress. Those green hats shimmering with spirit, and the words, "You must come back to me," kept echoing in his ears. If it weren't for being framed by Bryony, perhaps he could have had a bright future. Now, he is in the midst of purgatory, and Bryony, who framed him, is not having an easy time either. Although Bryony, now grown up, is still unsure if the man that night was Robbie, as she ages, she gradually understands what love is and realizes that she cannot label someone as a beast just because of a revealing love letter. Nor can she rely solely on her own prejudice to testify in front of the police, leading to sending the man she loves into the abyss. To make up for the mistakes she made, she not only gave up the opportunity to study abroad but also followed in Cecilia's footsteps to become a battlefield nurse saving lives. But no matter how hard she worked or how many hours she toiled each day, she could never find peace within her heart. So, she began to reminisce at night, writing down everything that had happened. When her roommate saw it and wanted to read it, she immediately covered it with her hand, saying it wasn't finished yet. Then she added, "Maybe it will never be finished." That day, during the day, Bryony was busy in the ward when suddenly an urgent bell rang outside. It turned out that wounded soldiers from the front line had arrived. In a daze, Bryony seemed to see Robbie's figure, but when the person turned around, she realized it was just her imagination. In the evening, Bryony, who could speak French, was assigned to care for a French soldier, offering a final bit of compassion. During their conversation, Bryony learned that this soldier had also been cared for by Cecilia and knew about his and Robbie's love story, even asking if they were married now. Bryony replied, saying she hoped they would get married soon. The man wanted to say more, but his injured head left him too weak. Seeing this, Bryony quickly got up to loosen his bandage, but the moment she untied it, she was so shocked she almost stopped breathing, because not only was there a large hole in his head, but it also emitted a suffocating stench. But to keep the man from knowing the truth, Bryony comforted him, saying it was nothing serious, while trembling as she re-bandaged the wound. However, due to the severe head injury, the man's consciousness began to blur, and he mistook Bryony for the girl he liked, tearfully asking, "Do you love me, Bryony?" Understanding his confusion, she unhesitatingly said, "I love you." The man, now free of regrets, finally closed his eyes and took his last breath, Even though Bryony had witnessed many deaths, she still couldn't get used to such farewells and worried that Robbie, who was on the battlefield, might meet the same fate. As she walked heavily out of the ward, she happened to see the news playing on the screen. The news first boasted about the success of the Dunkirk evacuation and then reported on the Queen's activities. Queen Elizabeth recently visited a factory supplying chocolate to the military and personally met with the factory owner and his fiancée. However, what shocked Bryony was that the factory owner was a wealthy businessman who had once visited her home, and his fiancée was her cousin who had been assaulted. Seeing this, Bryony suddenly had a bold guess. So, on her cousin's wedding day, she quietly went to the church and sat at the back, watching the two of them. When she saw the businessman's face again, a forgotten memory flashed in her mind. It turned out that on that night 4 years ago, she did see the man with her cousin, but it wasn't Robbie, it was the businessman. Out of spite, she deliberately identified Robbie, and from her cousin's panicked expression when she saw him, she finally understood that her cousin was willing that night. It turned out that when the businessman first arrived at Bryony's house, he and her cousin, who was also visiting, made eye contact. So, while searching for the runaway twins, they took the opportunity to consummate in the bushes. Unexpectedly, Bryony happened to catch them. To protect her own reputation, her cousin chose to go along with it and put all the blame on Robbie. Thus, they joined forces to push an innocent man into the abyss. The cruel truth made Bryony feel even more guilty. She had written countless letters asking for Cecilia's forgiveness but never received any response. Now, she finally mustered the courage to go to Cecilia's rented apartment to apologize in person for the mistakes she made in her youth. Since Robbie was falsely imprisoned, Cecilia had left that home. Although she was now the head nurse of a ward, her living conditions were far less luxurious than before. Looking at the simple environment of the room, Bryony felt even more uneasy. She said remorsefully, "I can go to the judge and change my testimony, tell everyone that Robbie was wronged." But before she could finish, Robbie, who had returned safely from the battlefield, stormed out of the bedroom. Robbie angrily denounced him for what he did back then, blaming him for sending him to prison without understanding the truth, and hating him even more for sending him to the battlefield as cannon fodder. When Bryony tried to excuse himself by saying he was too young to understand, Robbie scolded him again, asking if one really had to be 18 to know right from wrong. Some soldiers were also 18, yet they had already died on the battlefield. Seeing Robbie getting more and more agitated, Cecilia quickly stepped forward to comfort him. When he heard the familiar words, "Come back," Robbie finally calmed down. Then, she told Bryony to go to their parents and confess the whole truth. At this point, Bryony also revealed the truth, but now, her cousin and the wealthy businessman were already married, and she couldn't accuse her own husband. This meant that Robbie would never be able to clear his name of the crime of assaulting a young girl. The air was tense for a long time before Bryony sincerely apologized again, hoping for Robbie's forgiveness. Although still filled with resentment, Robbie was helpless at this point. However, even if he couldn't clear his name legally, he at least wanted everyone to know the truth. So, he asked Bryony to write down the entire story from beginning to end, without rhyming, embellishment, or exaggeration. After Bryony left, Robbie and Cecilia went to the seaside from the photo, where they played, laughed, and walked along the waves. After enduring hardships, they finally lived the life they had always wanted, moving into a small house with white walls and blue curtains. Years later, Bryony became a well-known writer. During an interview, a reporter asked him to introduce his 21st novel, Atonement. Bryony stated that this would be the last work of his life because he had been diagnosed with cerebral arteriosclerosis, and his brain would soon stop working, with his memory fading away. In fact, the draft of this novel was completed a long time ago, but he never knew where to start writing. This is an autobiographical novel, and I didn't change the names of the characters. For events I didn't personally experience, I collected first-hand information, such as the situation in prison and the Dunkirk evacuation. The only part one wrote myself was the ending for Robbie and Cecilia. It turns out that after the cousin's wedding, Bryony never went to see Cecilia, nor did he have the chance to apologize to Robbie in person, because Robbie died the day before the Dunkirk evacuation. According to his comrades, before he died, he was still holding Cecilia's photo, staring at it without closing his eyes. Cecilia Tallis drowned in a narrow tunnel during a German air raid when a water pipe exploded while she was in an underground shelter. She never got to see Robbie one last time. What's even more heartbreaking is that the only time they truly spent together was just a few minutes in the study and dining room. Bryony said they should have been together, and they deserved to be together. So in the novel, I gave them back their happiness. To me, this wasn't weakness or escapism, but a belated act of kindness and apology. Atonement is directed by Joe Wright, starring James McAvoy and Keira Knightley. It was released in 2007 as a romance film, adapted from the novel of the same name by the famous British author Ian McEwan. Robbie, although just the child of a lower-class servant, was diligent, kind, and upright. Even though he secretly loved the family's eldest daughter, Cecilia, and she felt the same for him, he never dared to overstep his bounds. He even kept his distance outside to avoid embarrassing Cecilia in front of her aristocratic friends. If it weren't for that explicit letter he accidentally wrote, he might never have ended up with Cecilia. But it was also this letter that completely ruined his life. 13-year-old Bryony, who loved writing, often concocted dramatic scenarios in her mind. So when she saw the disheveled Cecilia angrily standing in front of Robbie, when she saw the letter Robbie wrote to Cecilia, and when she saw Robbie pinning Cecilia against the wall, she used her imagination and inner jealousy to paint Robbie as a hypocrite, even slandering him as a beast who defiled a young girl. This destroyed his promising future and life, burying it in the cold prison and the merciless battlefield. Until his last breath, he never got to see the girl who always hoped for his return. It's fair to say that Bryony's jealousy completely ruined two people's happy lives. Even if she spent the rest of her life atoning, it wouldn't change anything. After all, the dead cannot come back to life, and a belated apology is powerless. Everything was just a way to seek her own peace of mind. The promise that lingered in her heart, the love they both spent their lives trying to hold onto, was already destroyed by the merciless war and death. In life, there are always mistakes and sins that cannot be corrected or compensated for. Yet, the fragility and misjudgment of human nature can always bring about irreversible harm. Especially, jealousy and prejudice are like weeds growing wildly in the field of the mind. They absorb the nutrients from within, yet bloom into flowers of evil and bear bitter fruit. This weed twists the mind, stripping it of its original purity and beauty. It's often said that time heals all wounds. For the victims, as time passes, they might forget the past pain, but the scars that remain can never be healed. As for those who have erred, most will bury their shameful side deep within as the years go by. Even if some feel guilt and repent, it's merely a quest for inner peace. However, it must be admitted that when mistakes cannot be corrected, acknowledgement and repentance themselves become a redemption of the soul. Moreover, whether victim or perpetrator, being trapped in pain forever is of no help. Instead, we should all learn from history and strive to prevent any regrets from happening again. Alright, that's it for today's movie sharing. Please like, comment, and share. Looking forward to our next encounter.